Having just given some criteria for how to draw the boundaries of ecosystems, we now have to ask the question, how big an ecosystem do we draw? Do ecosystems need to be relatively small and then aggregated, or do ecosystems need to be relatively big? On what scale are we going to study ecosystems? Now, the authors in their book state that ecosystem processes can be studied at many spatial scales. And this is really important. There's no one best spatial scale to study ecosystems. The example that they give shows that this ecosystem approach that we use can be applied at many scales, almost incorporating the entire scales that you'd expect on the global scale. So for example, for an endolithic system, thinking about organisms that live inside rocks and control rock weathering, you would have your rock surface, and then inside of there are going to be lichens and maybe algae on the inside of that. And then when we take a look at pools and flexes, we're just going to think about an individual rock, and that's going to be on the order of millimeters. In contrast, sometimes we're going to go work on individual forests, and that scale might be on the kilometer scale or on the meter scale. It's not unreasonable to go into a forest and try and study the pools and fluxes that occur on the order of meters, even up to kilometers. And when we're thinking, if our question is something about how acid rain influences forest productivity, that's usually a question that we go and do sets of measurements on the scale of meters, if not up to kilometers. In contrast, when we start to ask the question about deforestation and how that starts to affect water supplies, then we're going to work on the scale of drainage basins, of watersheds, and that scale is often on tens of kilometers. And so you'll have a watershed, and we'll try and do measurements within that watershed that are relatively representative so we can extrapolate out over the entire watershed. And the scale of the study that we're working on is going to be tens of kilometers. In contrast, sometimes we're going to work on the entire global scale, and we're going to think of the entire globe as a single ecosystem. And so in this case, if we're starting to think about carbon, and carbon becoming lost from soil due to agriculture and plowing, and how that in turn affects the climate of the entire globe, we're going to start to work on the scale of thousands of kilometers. The grid cells that we're going to use are going to be relatively large, and we're going to aggregate those on a pretty large basis. And that becomes a relatively large scale. And just like we're going to take a look at ecosystems and apply that ecosystem approach on a variety of spatial scales, we're also going to apply it on a variety of temporal scales. Sometimes we're going to do measurements that occur every second. Sometimes we're going to think about measurements that the unit of measurement is going to be years, hundreds of years, even thousands of years. What's important to remember is that when we're starting to think about the spatial scales that we'll do our analyses and the temporal scales that we do our analyses, these two are going to be interrelated. So for example, if we're starting to work on the scale of an individual leaf, which might have a spatial scale of centimeters and a temporal scale of seconds, it's going to be a relatively small spatial scale and a relatively fine temporal scale. When we measure photosynthetic rates for leaves, we're thinking about the amount of carbon dioxide that's going in and out of a leaf per unit second. It's not often that we're going to think about that leaf and think about it on the millennial time scale. In contrast, by the time we're getting up to the global scale, somewhere up here, where we're going to be working on the thousands of kilometers scale, something like that, even just a kilometer scale, those temporal scales tend to get longer and longer. It's not often that we divide the entire globe up into square kilometers or thousands of kilometers squared and start to continue to work at the second scale. Usually by the time we're up to that scale, we're working on an annual scale, sometimes even longer. If we're thinking about geologic processes, that quite often that temporal scale is going to be on the hundreds, thousands, even on the millennial scale. What's important to remember when we're choosing how large an ecosystem is that we're going to study, that ecosystems are constructs. These are tools that we use to go out and think about, better understand the world around us. And the scale that we choose is going to be based on the question that we have. that question is really key, and we want to make sure that there's not necessarily a mismatch between the temporal or the spatial scale and the question that we want to understand. So as we go through this book and we think about ecosystem ecology, you'll see that we're going to work across a variety of scales. Sometimes we're going to be thinking about processes that occur on the second scale, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in days, and at other times there are much slower processes that the individual process might happen relatively quickly, but we think about it on longer time scales because it changes so infrequently. So the scale that we use, how large the ecosystem is and over what time scale we set our measurements to be, is going to be based on the question.